This is land of Havilah, Acts 27. Paul is about to embark for Rome, verse 1. When it was determined that we should set sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners to a centurion named Julius of the Augustan band. Embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to places on the coast of Asia, we put to sea, Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. Comment 3 chapters ago, Felix received Paul as prisoner and gave him some privileges, including access to friends. So we see now in verses 1 and 2 we just read that Paul has friends with him as he sails for Rome. We're familiar with Aristarchus in verse 2 because he was one of two friends of Paul who was dragged into the theater in Ephesus. And in verse 1 it's another we passage, so the author is with Paul as well. Luke wound up in Rome with Paul, 2 Timothy 1:8 and 17 and 2 Timothy 4:11, so that again is consistent with the idea that Luke is the author. They put out to sea in verses 1 and 2 with a centurion named Julius in charge of the prisoners, now sailing north up the coast, verse 3. The next day we touched at Sidon. Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him permission to go to his friends and refresh himself. Putting to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Comment in verse 3, Julius gave Paul permission to go ashore at Sidon and visit friends. He trusted him not to escape. In verse 4, they put out to open sea and sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. They sailed around the northern end of Cyprus because that route gave them better protection from an unfavorable wind. Coming up, they sailed along the coast of Asia Minor, headed west. Verse 5. When we had sailed across the sea which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy, and he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days and had come with difficulty opposite Cnidus, the wind not allowing us further, we sailed under the lee of Crete opposite Salmone. With difficulty sailing along it, we came to a certain place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. Comment in verses 4 to 8, they landed on the southwestern coast of Asia Minor at a city called Myra. Lucius transferred Paul and his friends to a different ship, that much is clear, and they transferred them to the custody of another centurion and his men, which will be clear as we go on. We might be envisioning a very small ship, but come to find out there were 276 people on board at the end of the voyage, plus a cargo of unknown type, possibly wheat. All along the winds were contrary. They arrived with difficulty at the port of Fair Havens on the southern shore of Crete. Crete's a large island about 60 miles off the southern tip of Greece. Coming up, they're way behind schedule because winds have been contrary and the stormy winter season is approaching. Verse 9. When much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because the fast had now already gone by, Paul admonished them and said to them, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion gave more heed to the master and to the owner of the ship than to those things which were spoken by Paul. Because the haven was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised going to sea from there, if by any means they could reach Phoenix and winter there, which is a port of Crete looking northeast and southeast. Comment in verse 9, the fast was past, meaning the Day of Atonement, so it's late September or sometime in October. Sailing's getting dangerous because of the risk of high winds that time of year. In verse 10, Paul warned the crew that they should winter right where they were in Fair Havens on the southern coast of Crete. He said that because the Lord told him if they went on, there'd be injury, loss of cargo, loss of the ship, and loss of lives. But in verses 11 and 12, those in charge decided to risk it and try to get 50 miles further down the coast to a protected harbor called Phoenix. Phoenix faced southeast and northeast in verse 12. Looking at it on a map and checking modern weather patterns in Crete, it's obvious Phoenix is protected from the prevailing northern and western winds that time of year. Speaking of the crew, verse 13. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But before long a stormy wind beat down from shore, which is called Euroclydon. Comment in verse 13, a south wind blew softly. The conditions seemed to be favorable for sailing on another 50 miles to a better place. May God deliver us from south winds that blow softly, deceiving us into unwise courses of action. Following the soft wind from the south, a vicious wind called Euroclydon set in. It comes from the northeast and causes large waves, thus the name Euro, which means east, and Clydon, which means waves. It was so strong, verse 15. When the ship was caught and couldn't face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Clauda, we were able with difficulty to secure the boat. After they had hoisted it up, they used cables to help reinforce the ship. Fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis sandbars, they lowered the sea anchor and so were driven along. Comment in verses 15 to 17, the Euroclydon blew them uncontrollably away from Crete into the open sea. They got some slight relief when they passed near a small island called Clauda that blocked the wind a little bit. The ship's boat was either hanging over the side and being pounded by waves, or it was floating, being attached to the ship by a tether, and risking damage to itself and the main ship when they collided. Whichever, they hoisted it aboard with difficulty because of the weather. As they continued to blow along out of control, they feared they would crash on the Syrtis sandbars, which extend far off the coast of northern Africa. The best they could do was lower the sea anchor. Sea anchors don't reach bottom, they drag the water to slow the ship down. That way, when they ran aground somewhere, they wouldn't hit so hard, and maybe the hull wouldn't be smashed to pieces. Coming up as they were driven along, they threw things overboard to make the ship lighter. When the water was shallow enough, they could lower the main anchors. A lighter ship would give the anchors a better chance of not being dragged along the bottom, and the ship a better chance of not running aground. Verse 18. As we labored exceedingly with the storm, the next day they began to throw things overboard. On the third day they threw out the ship's tackle with their own hands. Comment in verse 18, they began to throw things overboard. They're making the ship lighter, again so the anchors can hold better when the time comes, and maybe so the ship rides higher in the water and the deck doesn't get swamped with each wave, and a lighter ship might save the hull from being broken up when they run aground. Their best hope right now is to run aground and be stuck, but without breaking up. There's no way they would be so lucky as to blow into a deep harbor. In verse 19, they threw the ship's tackle over, also translated gear. As we'll find out, there's at least some tackle remaining. Coming up, Paul received a word from an angel that appeared to him in the night. Maybe the crew will listen to the word this time, because Paul was right last time that they shouldn't have left Fair Havens. Verse 20. When neither sun nor stars shone on us for many days, and no small storm pressed on us, all hope that we would be saved was now taken away. When they had been long without food, Paul stood up in the middle of them and said, Sirs, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and have gotten this injury and loss. Now I exhort you to cheer up, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel belonging to the God whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Don't be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. Behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, sirs, cheer up, for I believe God that it'll be just as it's been spoken to me. But we must run aground on a certain island. Comment in verse 21, they had been long without food. As it turns out, they do have a little food, but they're saving it for later. In the first divine word, back in verse 10, there would be loss of life. But in the second word, in verse 22 we just read, there would be no loss of life because Paul prayed and God granted mercy as far as the loss of life was concerned. We know Paul prayed and God answered because the angel said in verse 24, quote, God has granted you all those who sail with you, end quote. And maybe that even extended to their eternal souls, that God granted Paul their eternal souls as well, because they're beginning to listen to him. The scenario here proves that not all prophecy comes to pass, because even if a prophecy is legitimate, prayer might change the outcome. The original prophecies was that there would be loss of life, but after Paul prayed, the second prophecy was that there would not be loss of life. That didn't make the first prophecy untrue. It meant Paul was able to pray and change things. Concerning the new prophecy, Paul said in verse 25, "Cheer up, for I believe God that it'll be just as it's been spoken to me." Time and time again it comes out just as God has spoken it, so we can cheer up. Paul says they'll run aground on a certain island, they'll lose the ship, and verse 27, "But when the 14th night had come, as we were driven back and forth in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors surmised that they were drawing near to some land. They took soundings and found 20 fathoms. After a little while they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. Fearing that we would run aground on rocky ground, they let go 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daylight." Comment in verses 27 to 29, the soundings they took during the night kept getting shallower. When it was 15 fathoms, which is 90 feet, they put down 4 anchors from the back end of the boat and wished for day. They're wondering whether they can see land from their present location. Coming up as dawn approaches, some of the sailors are lowering the ship's boat into the water, pretending they'll lay out more anchors, but the real intention is to escape to shore, which will leave the others stranded, the wind still wreaking havoc. Verse 30. As the sailors were trying to flee out of the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea, pretending that they would lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Unless these stay in the ship, you can't be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and let it fall off. Comment, the centurion either trusted Paul's prophecies by now, or he could see for himself the ship's boat could blow away and not be able to return because of the high wind and high seas. So he cut the ropes as the sailors were lowering the boat into the water. We can deduce the boat floated away empty. Verse 33. While the day was coming on, Paul begged them all to take some food, saying, "Today's the 14th day that you wait and continue fasting, having taken nothing. Therefore I beg you to take some food, for this is for your safety, for not a hair will perish from any of your heads." When he had said this and had taken bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. Then they all cheered up, and they also took food. In all there were 276 souls on the ship. When they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Comment, way back in verse 18, they began to throw things overboard. In verse 38 we just read, they threw the wheat into the sea, which must have been the last of it. They're still trying to make the ship lighter. Coming up, daylight came, and they saw land, but didn't recognize it. Back in verse 20, they didn't see the sun and stars for many days, therefore they have no idea where they are. Verse 39. When it was day, they didn't recognize the land, but they noticed a certain bay with a beach, and they decided to try to drive the ship onto it. Casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, at the same time untying the rudder ropes. Hoisting up the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. Comment, they left the anchors sitting on the bottom rather than bringing them aboard, again to make the ship lighter. The owner was on board in verse 11. At least he's not a cheapskate trying to save everything he can. Trying to get the ship as close to land as possible, verse 41. But coming to a place where 2 seas meet, they ran the vessel aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, but the stern began to break up by the violence of the waves. The soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim out and escape. But the centurion, desiring to save Paul, stopped them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should throw themselves overboard first to go toward the land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and some on other things from the ship. So they all escaped safely to the land. Comment, those who could swim did, and those who couldn't rode anything that floated. The soldiers didn't kill the prisoners, and they all escaped safely to land. Acts 28 is next. Here's the map of Acts 27. They departed Caesarea by ship, landed the next day at Sidon, struck out toward the island of Cyprus, went the northern route around Cyprus because of the wind, sailed past the provinces of Cilicia and Pamphylia, changed ships at the city of Myra, passed by Cnidus on the tip of the Asia Minor mainland, then off Salome on the eastern end of Crete, to the not-so-good port of Fair Havens on the southern coast of Crete, tried to go for the better port of Phoenix on the southern coast of Crete, got blown into the sea past the small island of Clauda, blew for 14 days plus, they didn't know where. The land they see now will turn out to be the small island of Malta, just south of Italy and south of Sicily. So they're actually not far off course for Italy, but they did it the hard way. When they were out of control, they averaged about 40 miles per day. Acts 28 is next.